Welcome to Old School October. I'm the book guy, and this month we are looking at classic fantasy from the 50s through to the 90s, and we're going to see how that era of fantasy shaped the modern fantasy that we know and love today. Today we're looking at the grandfather of modern fantasy, which is Lord of the Rings, and the question is, do you want to read Lord of the Rings, and what about all these other books in the extended Middle-earth canon? Are you a bit confused by all these books that get published with Tolkien's name on them even 50 years after his death? He's been gone for half a century, and he still publishes more frequently than George R. R. Martin. Today I've got my shelf of Middle-earth works, and I'm going to be introducing them to you one at a time. It's going to be a bit different to my usual videos, a bit of a different format, different segments, but I'm going to help you decide which one of these you want to read. And just to be clear, you do not have to read every single one. You can pick and choose. I will be making a case that everyone should read The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion at least once in their lifetime, but it's still up to you. Just want to be upfront about that agenda of mine, but I want to help you decide just how deep you want to go into Middle-earth.
So it begins.
The first of these works is The Hobbit. Now, it's by far the best place to start reading in Middle-earth. Now, you might be thinking, oh, I've seen the movies, I know this. No, wrong, you don't. Now, I'm not here to criticize the Hobbit film trilogy. It's been done before, and you're welcome to enjoy those films, but the book itself is very different for two main reasons. Number one, the book is not an epic fantasy book. It's a children's book. And number two, it's less like Lord of the Rings and more like a classic fairy tale collection. This is a story about a small hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, who lives a comfortable life. Bilbo is one day whisked away by the wizard on an adventure. He has to help a group of dwarves steal some of their gold back from the evil dragon Smaug. And on this journey, he might just realize that courage comes in all sizes. This story has all the elements of a classic children's fairy tale, very much in the vein of Beowulf, or St. George's Dragon, or that Brother Grimm's story, The Two Brothers, starring the seven-headed dragon. This story is very much for children. It is whimsical, adventurous, and very much an explorative fantasy, with a new wonder over every hill. It's also a short book, so it's relatively light reading for most readers. Just keep in mind, it was published in 1939, so the language is a little bit older and might be a bit tricky for that reason. If you have watched the movies, I strongly recommend reading the book instead. The story is very different. Plus, The Hobbit has this really unique distinction where it's quicker to read the book and takes longer to watch the movie. I'll talk more about The Hobbit a little bit later when we discuss Tolkien's life. Now, on to the big one. I assume you all know the story, but hey, let's just introduce it anyway. Let's just revel in it. Frodo Baggins receives his uncle's old ring as his inheritance, but Gandalf the wizard begins to suspect it's not just a regular old ring. Frodo is now the owner of the One Ring, crafted by the great Lord Sauron. If the Dark Lord finds this ring again, he will use its power to dominate all of Middle-earth. Frodo begins a perilous journey accompanied by his loyal friends on a quest to destroy the One Ring and save Middle-earth. And look, before I go any further, I've got to address the elephant in the room, and I've got to do it really early in the video too. So these days, most people watch the movies first and then go and read the books and compare the two. Yet there is such a difference between the books and the films that most people will get disappointed because it didn't live up to their expectations. This is a side effect of the movies simply being so great. You see, overall, the movies are a pretty accurate telling of the story. I would rate it about 70%. On story adaptation accuracy. And I suspect others would rate it lower, but damn it, 70% just feels pretty right to me. So if the story is 70% similar, why is there such a difference between the books and the films? Simple. The difference is in the style and the emphasis. So the movies amp up the action scenes in a really big way, and they skim a little bit on the walking scenes. And that's kind of what you expect from a movie. It's kind of what a movie should do. The style of the movie is epic, with the fate of the world in the balance, and of course a huge focus on the characters who are the heart of the story. Meanwhile, the books are slightly different. You've probably heard that the books have a lot of walking, or a lot of details about random stuff that's kind of unnecessary. And yeah, that's true. In fact, let me give you an example. So let's look at this sequence. Frodo and his party of hobbits have just met Strider, and they've just left Bree. So in this sequence, they journey for a while before they reach Weathertop, and then they have a big fight with the Ring Wraiths. Now in the movie, extended edition of course, the whole sequence takes 9 minutes in total. Now it takes 5 minutes and 35 seconds of journeying to get to Weathertop, and 3 minutes and 25 seconds for the fight itself. And I define the fight itself as starting from this moment.
You fools, put it out! That's nice!
Yeah, because that's when it becomes tense. Now in the book, this same sequence is 20 pages long exactly, but it is 19 pages of journeying, and the fight itself is over 1 page long. In fact, I'll be generous and call it 1.5 pages. It's a wide margin of difference. In fact, let's put a number to it. So the sequence in the movie is approximately 60% walking and 40% action. And the books have 95% journey and 5% action. And I'd say this ratio feels about right for the books, particularly Fellowship, which is the least action-heavy of the three. So that's a pretty big difference. In fact, Christopher Tolkin, son and editor of Tolkien Sr., actually criticized the movies for this reason. He said they gutted the book, making an action film for 15 to 25-year-olds. Keep in mind, Christopher was very particular about changes to his father's work, which we'll discuss more in a moment. But it's also true. The books do not have anywhere near the amount of action of the films. It is something that a lot of readers will struggle with when they go to the books after the movies, including me. Here's a fun story. I was 12 years old when I watched The Fellowship of the Ring for the first time on a PlayStation, and I thought it was the coolest thing that you could play a DVD off a PlayStation. I'm pretty old. So I was 12 when I first watched Fellowship of the Ring, and I loved it, and I immediately raced out to buy the books. I read all of Fellowship, and I was bored. I was so disappointed by how anticlimactic all of the action scenes were, that when I finished book 1, I did not go on to books 2 and 3. Keep in mind, I was 12. But I want to convince you that the books truly are amazing. One of the greatest artistic achievements of all of humanity. It's important to first separate the movies from the books so you appreciate what the books actually are. There are so many wonderful things about the Lord of the Rings books. The whole long periods of walking thing tends to get over-exaggerated, I feel. So forget all that, here's the good stuff. First big thing, this world is beautifully depicted in staggering detail. It feels real. So yes, there's a lot of detail, but this is also going to be one of the most immersive reading experiences you'll ever have. You can get absolutely lost in these books. Remember, Tolkien was writing this at a time when fantasy and fairy tales were considered to be for children, so he was determined to show such a brilliantly well thought out world that would change people's minds about fantasy, and it did. Tolkien's Middle-earth impressed so many people and shut down so many critics. It's still, to this day, one of the most well-realized fictional worlds. Second big thing is the ancient history. So yes, Middle-earth is meant to be Earth, but in the long-distant past. However, even at the time of the story, Middle-earth already had a great history. This is where Tolkien's professorship really shines through. Every place, person, or thing isn't just there on the road by chance. Each thing has a long history spanning thousands of years that all led up to this moment. And yes, this history does add to the realism I mentioned earlier, but it also adds an element of mystery. As real as this world is, there is still so much that's unknown. It constantly intrigues you to read more. Traveling through Middle-earth is a lot like being a tourist in an ancient city. Like Rome, for example, where every step you take is on a cobblestone that was laid thousands of years earlier. Everything in The Lord of the Rings feels like it should be one of those UNESCO World Heritage Sites marked for preservation. The next big thing is the heroics, but specifically, the heroics of everyday people. Lord of the Rings is about everyday, normal people who step up, who show exceptional bravery and prove themselves as heroes. It's inspiring as hell. The movies do show this to a good extent, but it's usually more their heroes because of awesome butt-kicking action scenes. In the books, it is clear that these are people who are just like you and me, who are scared of the big world and overwhelmed by the big goals they're trying to achieve. It's heroics less like this, and more like this.
I will take the ring to Mordor, though I do not know the way.
Remember, Tolkien fought in World War I. He was in the trenches on the battlefield for 5 months, and he saw his friends die. But he also saw the bravery of everyday people, the little people. He saw normal people become heroes, and that left a lasting effect on him and his work. Lord of the Rings is all about everyday heroes and reminds us what we are all capable of. The real story of Lord of the Rings, or the moral of the story if you prefer, is that power will corrupt you but friendship makes you better. We see characters like Saruman and Denethor fall from grace because they trust in their power and the strength of their will, but the Fellowship remain loyal and true. Remember, this is the story that gives us possibly the greatest on-screen friendship of all time.
I'm glad to be with you, Samwise Gamgee, here at the end of all things.
So this is another big reason to read the books. We get to know these characters even deeper and see their friendships forming even deeper. Yes, we love Legolas and Gimli, but they have a lot more on-screen time in the books. And yes, we love Frodo and Sam, but we see so much more of their characters. And on that note, Frodo in the movies is fine, and he's very well acted, but his whole arc is just about the ring. Frodo doesn't really have a personality outside of the ring. When in the books, Frodo is a real standout protagonist because of his cleverness. Where all the hobbits live in essentially a small town and have small town vibes, Frodo has been reading books about the outside world, so he's quite educated, he's adventurous, and he has such a beautiful case of wanderlust. And that's what makes it particularly heartbreaking when he loses that at the end. The final thing I'll mention is the writing itself. So Tolkien was a master of language, not just languages. So every sentence in this story is beautiful writing. Every line of the text just sings. I cannot emphasize enough just how good the prose is in every book. There are so many strengths to this book, and that's why it kills me that people focus so much on long periods of walking or a lack of action scenes, because there are so many different strengths in the books that just didn't quite make it into the films, and they really are worth enjoying. I should also mention, there's these new audiobook versions done by Andy Serkis. I'm sorry I don't talk about the audiobook version more often in my videos, but hey, I'm happy to endorse this one. So I did a read-through of Lord of the Rings earlier this year because of the Andy Serkis narrated audiobook versions. And it's not just a big Hollywood name, it is damn good, top quality narration. So you probably forget, but Andy Serkis' normal speaking voice is this beautiful, crisp British accent with perfect diction. I could listen to that guy read the dictionary or the phone book.
Many of the orcs were using ordinary language. Apparently, the members of 2 or 3 quite different tribes were present, and they could not understand one another's orc speech.
What's extra special about these editions is the voices. So yes, Andy does voices for the characters, as is very common in audiobooks, but it's special here because he does a voice based off the movie versions of the characters. So yes, Andy Serkis does his own voice for Gollum, and shockingly, it's kind of amazing.
We promised to save our precious, not to let him have it.
For all the Gandalf parts, he literally does an impersonation of Sir Ian McKellen's Gandalf. It's incredible, and his delivery of the "you shall not pass" scene just gives me all the chills. But he does an impersonation of Billy Boyd's Pippin and Sean Astin's Samwise. The voices are just marvelous, and it's a real delight to listen to them. This is a great way to experience the stories in a fresh way. Andy does a version for The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, and they're all worth listening to. Speaking of which, let's talk about The Silmarillion. Well, here we are. The almighty Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is a pretty complicated book, for a few reasons. Now put it this way, I don't reread books very often, and that's just a personal choice. If I read a book twice, that's a big deal. I very rarely read a book 3 times. I've read the Silmarillion about 5 times, and I'm planning a 6th read soon, because it's just that complex. But it's also, I believe, one of the greatest books ever written. So here's why. The concept is that the Silmarillion is a collection of all the old stories that took place before The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. The book is a collection of myths from all the ages long past. The intention by Tolkien was that this would be an in-world history book. You might even say that Bilbo Baggins was the editor putting it all together. That idea didn't make it into the final text, but you can sort of see it in how they were written. So there are 5 parts to this book. The first part is this word. I think it's pronounced Ain Nulin Dale. Something like that. It tells the story of the myth of the world's creation. So how the god Ilúvatar created Earth and filled it with all the lesser gods to rule it. Part 2 is the Valenquentar, describes these gods known as the Valar and their servants, the Maiar? I think that's how it's pronounced. Oh boy, I should have practiced this. So part 1 and 2 are the highest myths of this era. Very little hard facts, but it's a fascinating way to present a far distant history that no one was actually there for, from a time beyond knowing. Now, the third part of the Silmarillion actually makes up the biggest chunk of the story and the real heart of the story. It's the Quenta Silmarillion, the story of the Silmarils. The greatest elven smith, Fëanor, crafts the most perfect jewels, the Silmarils, but the fallen god Melkor steals them in his greed. Fëanor is furious that this crime was committed in the heart of the kingdom of the gods, at the very capital of their power. Convinced now of the powerlessness of the gods, the elves rebel against them. Led by Fëanor, they begin an ultimately hopeless quest to fight the Dark God on their own and claim the Silmarils back. So you know how Lord of the Rings was filled with heroics, and it was inspirational, and there were close friendships? Yeah, now forget all of that. This story is a tragedy. The war for the jewels is filled with great deeds of valor and bravery that are all ultimately doomed.
Doomed!
In Lord of the Rings, the friends stand together and ultimately succeed together. In the Silmarillion, elves, men, and dwarves turn on each other constantly because of fear and suspicion. It is largely that lack of trust that is the reason why this is such a tragic story. You still see the brave acts of everyday people, but you also see how sometimes it's not enough. I think in many ways the Silmarillion is the story that really depicts the horrors that Tolkien went through in the World War I trenches. Fighting bravely, dying bravely, and ultimately not sure if it really made a difference. Also, it's been so long since I first read the book, but I still want to weep whenever I think of the 5th battle, the Nirnaeth and Nodiad, also known as the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. The book is also tricky to read because of its structure. So there are 26 chapters in the Quenta Silmarillion. Each of these were originally more like a short story that Tolkien wrote separately on its own as the background for the greater work. After Tolkien died, his son Christopher took all of these stories and arranged them in chronological order in order to form a mostly cohesive story. He even expanded on some parts where there were gaps to sort of fill in the missing pieces. So each chapter is a self-contained tale with the beginning, middle, and end. And when you read it all in order, you do get a sense of a greater tale woven between them. It does work really well, but it wasn't the format Tolkien intended when he wrote them. Remember, Silmarillion is not a traditional novel. The real joy here is the summary style of writing. So this story is not written like a regular novel where it'll sort of spell out exactly what happens in step-by-step detail. This story is a summary of grand events. So sometimes we get significant events that are summed up in about a paragraph or two. So it can be hard to get into, but it's also half the fun, because each sentence is so full of implications. We read about many great events that are almost skimmed over, and that's where our imagination takes over and fills in all the blanks. The summary style of writing makes it feel like it's an oral history, where people would sit down around a campfire and tell it and pass it on one generation to the next. It's why I've read this book so many times over and over, because there's so much that happens in so few words. The section, the Quenta Silmarillion, is only about 300 pages, and it's a relatively short book, yet it is so densely packed that it takes a while to unpack it.
I just have to add, I talked about the Silmarillion so much, and yet I didn't actually explain. It's just epic, and it's cool. That's one of the big selling points for reading the Silmarillion. It is just a cool story. So there are dragons and balrogs and giant spiders and noble heroic deeds like you wouldn't believe. It is just fantasy on a level that you rarely get in any other story. And it's just the cool factor that makes it so interesting to read. I should add that as well.
So moving on, the fourth part of the Silmarillion is the book The Akalabath. It's about the kingdoms of men and the fall of the great island capital of Numenor. It's similar to the Silmarillion in many ways, especially the tragedy. And the final fifth part of the book is Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. It's literally a summary of The Lord of the Rings, which sounds kind of basic, but it's also an explanation of many events that didn't make it into the final book. It does add a lot of greater context to the main trilogy. This fifth part is largely going over territory we've already covered, but there are also some delightful insights it gives to the main text. Okay, I hope all of that clarifies the Silmarillion for you and kind of conveys why it's such a good book. As I said at the start, the works of The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion are all worth reading. I would make a strongest case for that. From this point onwards, it's reader's choice. So Unfinished Tales is very similar to the Silmarillion in that it was leftover work by Tolkien that his son Christopher put together in the few short years after his passing. However, the big difference is the Silmarillion tells all these tales that do sort of form one cohesive tale, whereas Unfinished Tales is much more like extra scenes that get added on to existing scenes. So think of it like deleted scenes for a movie, or even like behind the scenes insights. So this book is where we start getting a bit more of an academic interest in the study of Tolkien rather than more entertaining stories. In that sense, it's priceless for the perspective and insight it gives to the greater series. Almost everything in Unfinished Tales is told elsewhere. So, for example, a huge chunk of the book is the story of Turin. Now, Turin was already a major character in the Silmarillion, and one of the largest chapters, one of those mini tales, is about Turin. In the Unfinished Tales, we get a much more expanded version of the same story. So here is a list of all the stories that feature in Unfinished Tales. I will say of particular note is the Quest for Erebor. That's Gandalf's account of how he met Thorin and how he came to send the dwarves to Bilbo's Hobbit hole. That story is the basis of the scene at the start of the second Hobbit film, where Gandalf meets Thorin in the Tavern of Bree. So mostly though, this whole list is extra reading. If you really like Lord of the Rings, then by all means it will be fun and insightful for you, but it is a little bit more of a slog. So I've skirted around this topic a few times so far, now is the time to address it directly. Let's discuss the Tolkien timeline. Just remember, this has been discussed at length by other YouTubers. I'm not going to do the full thing, so this is a short version. So young John Tolkien was deployed on the front lines of World War I. He spent 5 months as a lieutenant in charge of a troop of soldiers, and he led those troops into multiple conflicts. Then he contracted a fever and had to be taken off the front lines. He spent most of the rest of the war in hospital recovering. His sickness was so severe that after the war, he was put on a disability pension. Sadly, once he left the front lines, almost everyone else in his troop died. While recovering from this fever, Tolkien started writing a story, The Fall of Gondolin. It was meant to be an invented mythology for England. He abandoned the story shortly after, but it was the start of his interest in creating myth. Tolkien worked as a professor. During this time, he wrote other old stories about the myths of England. He and his wife Edith had 4 children, and Tolkien used to entertain his children with little fairy tales he would make up about hobbits or little people going on grand adventures. And this is where Christopher comes in. Even as a young boy, Christopher used to nitpick his father on the accuracies of these stories. Dad, last time you said the door was green. It annoyed Tolkien Sr. so much, he started writing it down to keep track, and that became The Hobbit. So yes, thank you, Christopher Tolkien. So that's why I said earlier that The Hobbit is a story for children, because Tolkien wrote it for his children as a form of entertainment. That's why it does not suit the big adult epic fantasy that it became in the movies. Now here's the funny thing, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and published it, and it went well. Then he spent nearly 10 years writing a sequel, which ended up being The Lord of the Rings, a very different book. He thought it was one big book, and his publishers split it into 3 parts, which always annoyed him. The Lord of the Rings was pretty popular at the time and just kept getting more popular as time went on, and it's now become the thing that Tolkien is mostly remembered for. Yet, Tolkien considered The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to be the great distractions of his life. His real heart, his real great work, was his great mythology, what he called his legendarium. The extended works is where Tolkien spent most of his time before The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and after. After Tolkien passed, Christopher edited his works to create the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales. Yet Christopher's own great work came in what is the 12-volume series, The History of Middle-earth. So I'll say it up front, this series is not a list of in-world histories of Middle-earth. It's actually about John Tolkien Sr. and his life's work in writing the series and all the greater tales and the legendarium. Tolkien often rewrote his own work. So in the history of Middle-earth, they might discuss how there was a scrap of paper with notes that had additions scribbled onto it, and it was dated in the 1930s. Then you would find another note in the 1950s with its own scribbled on references that told the same story in a different way. This is part of the genius of Tolkien. He was a great writer, but he rarely finished a project. That's half the battle of writing a book. That's my advice to aspiring writers. Finish a project. It doesn't matter how good your idea is if it hasn't been written yet. So I haven't read The History of Middle-earth, and I don't really intend to read it because it's much more of an academic editorial look into the life of Tolkien. But for all you Tolkien mega fans, The History of Middle-earth is the ultimate insight into Tolkien's state of mind and his work style. So I couldn't talk about his works without mentioning this mammoth of a work. Now, let's move on to the Elder Tales. Alright, so these three tales were the original stories that Tolkien wrote first, before The Hobbit, before Lord of the Rings. Now, all three of these tales already exist in the Silmarillion, but remember how I said Silmarillion has that summary style of writing? The stories in that book are the short versions that sort of sum up the main events. These three books are the expanded versions of those tales. So the first one is The Children of Húrin. This is a fully functional novel. However, it's mostly the same story that was told in Unfinished Tales. So remember the story of Túrin? It's a short version in the Silmarillion and an expanded version in Unfinished Tales. Well, this is basically the same story as it appeared expanded in Unfinished Tales, but with new artwork.
Don't be fooled! She's just a regular Malibu Stacy with a stupid cheap hat!
But she's got a new hat.
To be clear, I do not want to mock it because I love the story of Húrin and his son Túrin. It's truly one of the most beautiful and tragic stories. Húrin was a great human male and great captain who fought in the fifth battle. Remember the fifth battle, the one that makes me cry every time? Húrin defies the dark god Melkor, and so Melkor, enraged, puts a mighty curse onto his name. And we see this cruel and unusual punishment carried out on Húrin's children, particularly his son Túrin. Túrin has probably the most tragic story in all of Middle-earth, and that's saying something. So next is Beren and Luthien, another great tale that's covered in the Silmarillion already, yet this book is actually not a novel like Children of Húrin was. This one is a collection of edited works. You see, Tolkien wrote several versions of the Beren and Luthien story. Almost all of those versions are unfinished. So Christopher compiled all of those versions into this edition. Christopher also wrote the summary prose version that we see in the Silmarillion to make sure the story was actually told in its complete version. Most noteworthy is the poem. So Tolkien wrote the tale originally in a long poem form, very similar to Beowulf. There is literally 6,000 lines of poetry in the Beren and Luthien story. It's beautiful poetry, yet it actually covers less than half of the actual story. So think of the Silmarillion version as the most canon, but it is still interesting to see the multiple versions of the story and the redrafts it went through, and reading the poem especially is a delight. And I should mention the story itself. It's a love ballad. So Beren is a mortal man who falls in love with the immortal elven princess Luthien. Their doomed romance is a beautiful tragedy. So when Beren asks for Luthien's hand in marriage, her father is enraged and demands the only price he will accept for her hand in marriage is one of the Silmarils themselves. The Silmarils, which currently reside in the crown that is worn on the head of the dark god Morgoth. Yet Beren is not dismayed, and he begins a quest to claim this ultimate prize.
'Tis the lay of Luthien, the elf maiden who gave her love to Beren, immortal.
The Fall of Gondolin is very much the same, so it's a collection of edited works and multiple versions of the same story, with notes from Christopher the editor giving context. And yes, it also includes a very long poem, a beautiful poem with great poetry that only covers about half of the actual story. Gondolin is the last and greatest city of all of the elves, and it still stands against Morgoth. And yes, as the title suggests, it falls. This story has some of the greatest demonstrations of awesome, badass, epic, dark magical powers, including Balrogs riding on dragons. Yay. It also includes the most noble of heroic deeds and desperate acts that are both heroic and tragic, and yet kind of hopeful. Now here's the real question, are all three of these books actually worth reading? And this is really a personal choice at this point. If you like the more academic deep dives into the Tolkien writing process, and you like seeing multiple versions of the same story, then yes, by all means you'll enjoy these. I also really respect Christopher Tolkien for not trying to write a definitive version where one didn't exist, but rather representing his father's works with as much accuracy and integrity as possible, even including the messiness and the unfinishedness of it. I'll also mention these three books are not like that recent book, The Fall of Numenor. So that book was released by the Tolkien estate after Christopher had passed, and it's the same story, but with new art. This book was timed to be released at the same time as The Rings of Power, which also takes place in Numenor, so this was a cash grab, whereas in these three were much more about artistic integrity. I also think these three great tales deserve their own editions because of how significant they are to the greater Middle-earth mythos. Plus, there's one special thing. You might consider this a spoiler. There was one tale that Tolkien wrote that Christopher did not include into the Silmarillion. It was called Arda Remade, and it tells of the last great war at the end times and the resurrection of the dead. It was never included because Tolkien changed his mind a few times about whether he wanted a resurrection or an afterlife for man. But this story is actually added into the Fall of Gondolin on the final pages, which means Arda Remade has become Lord of the Rings canon, and it was the last contribution Christopher Tolkien made into his final book before he passed away just a few months later. In Arda Remade, the dark god Morgoth breaks out of his prison and a final war is fought. Yet the greatest of the Valar, the greatest of the Maiar, and the greatest of mortal warriors all team up to fight Morgoth in one-on-one combat. And it's the mortal Turin, yes, Turin, who has the most tragic story of all, who delivers the killing blow to Morgoth. After Morgoth falls and his power is removed, the gods remake Arda one more time, including all the beauty that was lost in the wars with Morgoth and all of the beauty that has been made since then. The lost Silmarils are returned, Fëanor surrenders them willingly to the gods, who use them to birth back to life the two trees, and all is made right. You can't swing a cat in a fantasy section without encountering Tolkien's influence. Also, don't swing cats. They're nice. Except my cat, who did that to me this week. Oh my goodness. There were many fantasy writers before Tolkien, but he was the first to be, well, commercially viable. He's known as the grandfather of fantasy, and I do think that title is deserved, but a more accurate title would be grandfather of the fantasy bestseller. Tolkien has inspired a huge number of copycat authors doing very similar stories with a twist or two. Earthsea or Shannara come to mind, but there's also people writing anti-Tolkien fantasy, deliberately the opposite, almost in criticism of the Middle-earth story. So Stephen Donaldson and even Malazan can be seen as critiques of Tolkien. There is a big debate as to whether Tolkien's legacy should be honoured, or perhaps we should all move on from Tolkien. I'd be genuinely curious to know what you think about this, because Tolkien casts a long shadow on the fantasy genre. His work is wonderful, but it can also be limiting to the genre and limiting to the type of stories we tell. So what are your thoughts on that? Well, you've got a few options here. So I would still say The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion are like essential reading for any fantasy fan. And these further works should be read if you like reading history books or articles written by PhD professors. I also strongly recommend reading it in the order that it appears here on my shelf. In fact, start with The Hobbit, move this way, and go as far as you're comfortable. Read until you stop enjoying it, but you should read it in this order here. Ultimately, I can't answer for you how much you should try because it is different for every person with this series. So you can decide on which of these books you want to read, but I do hope this video has made it easier for you to make that decision. So good luck and happy reading. Alright, so this was our first outing into old school October, and I hope hope you've enjoyed that. So later this month, we are looking at Narnia, the Rift War cycle, and the Chronicles of Amber. I haven't finished reading Amber yet, so that's why I put that one to last, but there's lots of exciting things coming up on this channel this month, and I hope you'll stay tuned for that. Check out other videos on my channel if you're looking for a good book. Please consider subscribing or sharing one of these videos to promote the channel. If you really want to help the channel, you can buy something from our shop, Rainbow Space Unicorn, links in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I am the Book Guy, and I love you all. Bye!